Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad that you've taken the time to listen to another installment of the NTC podcast. So, this is episode 125. I'm Aaron Washington, your host, joining you guys again. Our CBA specialist over at NTC, Colin, is back with me on my right. He had to get his mic adjusted again. It's been a little bit of time since he's been on the program, but in any case, glad to have you back, Colin. It's been a minute, but your expertise is always welcome, always appreciated. So glad you can make it and ready to get nerdy again, man, with some of the CBA stuff. So should be a fun time.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very happy to be back. It's definitely been a while. Been posting online, but glad to be back on the pod again.
And for anybody that's watching or listening to this podcast, be sure to check out notradeclause.com. Go over to our media section. We have a new tab called Cap Notes. Colin has been hard at work to make sure that all the little specifics when it comes to some of those signings that we saw over the summer and just some little extra tidbits about the CBA and how it might apply to certain players. If you're interested in any of that stuff, be sure to go over and check out that section of the website. We just opened that up, and Colin has started dropping in little notes about these players. So definitely check that out. If you are a fan of any kind of CBA or just business of basketball, any of those topics, I think it's a really good read for sure. So the subject of this program primarily is going to be to discuss just the multitude of injuries that have hit the NBA over the past few weeks. We're going to dive into those injuries specifically, but also the disabled player exception and the fact that several teams have decided to not use all of their roster spots. So that's going to be towards the end of the program. We definitely want to get into that as well, and we're going to give some reasons as to why that might be the case. So to get started here, Colin, we're going to look at the disabled player exception, which, believe it or not, about 2 years ago, about the same time, we were discussing the disabled player exception. So this is definitely a little bit of bringing something back, but I think it's always good to go back and look at something like this because as of today, we haven't seen any season-ending injuries, and that's the context in which a team needs to be in to use this exception. But I mean, with the way things are going right now, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody tore an Achilles or tore an ACL or something like that to really knock a guy out all the way through the year to cause that to become a situation there. So just a few notes about how this is used, when it can be used. A team over the cap can replace a disabled player. That disabled player has to be determined to be out at least through June 15th of the following year. So if we're in 2024, that would be June 15th of 2025. That's determined by a fitness to play panel. If they evaluate a player and determine that there is a much higher chance that a player is not going to play than they are going to play, then the team is eligible to use that exception. And the amount for that exception it's a little bit tricky, but essentially it comes down to a team being able to either trade for a player or they can sign a free agent, but that salary can only be half of what the disabled player salary is, or the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, whichever is less. And just for reference, the 24-25 non-taxpayer mid-level exception is $12.8 million. So just to kind of give people a little bit of a point of reference on that. And if a team trades for a player, they can only be in the last year of their contract. And that player cannot be making any more than half plus 100,000 of the disabled player's salary. And as far as the time frame goes, teams can use it right now, but they only have until January 15th to use the disabled player exception. So the official time frame is from July 1st to January 15th. And that is basically that time frame that a team is working with. And the disabled player has to be on the team from the time the team submits its application through the date in which the exception is granted. So if the guy's determined to be out, they can't just ship the player out, cut him or whatever. They have to be on that team through the time that the team gets the exception. So just wanted a little bit of the groundwork for that exception here. Kyle, I'll let you kind of fill in any blanks that I might have left there. What do people need to know about this disabled player exception and all the little specifics that go along with it?
Sure. Just a couple of house cleaning things there. So as far as you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the injuries to the star players that we're seeing so far, luckily, aren't season ending. When this comes up, it's for season ending injuries. And like you said, the team has to request it to get it. So they have until January 15th to request the exception. Once they get the exception, they actually have until March 15th to use it. And then just one other tweak. The exception is treated just like a cap hold. It gets added to their team salary. And then if they use it to sign or acquire a player, then that player's contract is absorbed into the team salary in exchange for the disabled player exception. It's limited in its use. Teams oftentimes will get it and not even use it. As we were talking about, we discussed this topic 2 years ago, and it was for the Gallinari when he got injured for the Celtics. Of course, almost immediately they knew that was season ending, or they thought it was going to be. They applied for it and got it. And my recollection is they didn't end up using it because, again, it's the lesser of 50% of disabled players' current salary, or half of the non-taxpayer mid-level, which is $12 million and change. So at most, you're getting $6 million to go acquire another player, which is great to have in your back pocket if you need it. But with how limited it is and the time frame, and hopefully you don't have a player that even suffers a season-ending injury. So it's limited in circumstance, but it is available in some and at some points it does come into play for certain teams.
Yeah, all good points, Colin. And yeah, I echo those thoughts of just really hoping that no team has to use it. I mean, I think it's highly likely that a team finds itself in a situation where they're eligible. Unfortunately, we usually see at least one season-ending injury over the course of a season. But thankfully, as you said, right now, it doesn't look to be the case. So just keep those notes in mind in case this does happen. A player does go down and a team finds itself in a position to request it. Like Colin said, you have to request it, get it granted, and then go and use it. So the circumstances are tricky. It gives the team a little bit more, some more obstacles to use it, but it has been done in the past. And I mean, for as many injuries as we see, it never hurts to have another player on the roster to just soak up some minutes. And I mean, if nothing else, just to help give some of those other guys a breather and reduce the load on those players so that they themselves don't go down with an injury that the team has seen with a previous player. But speaking of injuries, Colin, I mean, unfortunately, we have a lot going on in the NBA right now. It seems like we say this every year about this time, but I mean, right now, it's really incredible how many players are out. I'm going to start with listing the players that have injuries and they have no clear timetable for return. So the ones I have so far are Zion Williamson, John Morant, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Middleton, and Scotty Barnes. So these are only the players to which we don't have a firm timeline for return. Chris Middleton might be the most concerning on this list. He hasn't played a game yet this season. The Bucks can really use him. We actually talked about that on our previous podcast. If you guys are looking for some notes about how the Bucks have done this season so far, definitely check that out. But it just seems like his timeline is getting pushed back week by week, and the team has been really just kind of vague about how he's doing and how things are progressing. So that's definitely concerning for them. Zion, Ja, and Scotty were suffered in the early part of the season, so they should be back with plenty of time to spare even before the All-Star game, I would imagine, if things go right. And then Kawhi, who knows? I just throw up a question mark on that one and just say, like, I'm not really sure at all. And it just seems like they're just going to take it really slow and see what happens. But luckily, they're doing okay so far, so they should be able to at least tread water until he comes back. But with these key injuries, it does come another opportunity for some players behind them in the rotation to step up and take up more of a load and to assert themselves. Starting with John Morant, it definitely means more of an opportunity for Scottie Pippen Jr. And this is a player that on this podcast we raved about. I want to say it was 3 or 4 podcasts ago before the season started. He was one of our low-key picks to have a big season. And now that Ja is out of the mix, I mean, he's doing it. He just recorded a triple-double, and tonight should be a really fun game for him going against the Lakers. That's a team that he himself said that gave up on him, so that's going to be some kind of a revenge game for him. And then also Jalen Wells, the rookie for Memphis, has had a really solid few weeks to start this season. And then you go and look at the other teams, same deal. With Kawhi being out, Norman Powell gets to cook. He's averaging 26 points a game so far, shooting 50% from three, 54% from two. So he's had a magnificent first few weeks of the season, looking like an all-star, actually kind of filling in that role that Paul George left over, if you can believe it or not. And then looking at some other players, I mean, there's tons here. So, I mean, I can go for probably another 10 minutes or so talking about all these guys that can fill in. But, Colin, with that list I threw out there, the first few names I threw out there, how concerned are you for these teams suffering with these injuries? And, how do you think they might fare in the wake of some of these absences?
Well, I think that what you said is right. It's just, it has to be the next man up mentality, right? And it all depends on their depth and their coaching and what these guys can do and what their young guys can do. Scottie Pippen Jr., he's had a hell of a run to get to where he is today, signing his multi-year deal, coming off a two-way. And again, that may have never happened if they didn't have all their injuries last year. But he was able to prove himself last year, get himself a standard contract, a 4-year deal, and now he's proving himself over and over again with Ja Morant out. So I think it really just comes down to the length of the injuries and how many injuries you end up having, because I think teams in the short term can make up for it. I think players almost get excited. They're not excited that the star player gets injured, but I think mentally they say, okay, it's my turn now. We have to step up for our guy, and we have to show up and show out, in the short period of time. Now, can they do that over the entire season? No, but you look at a game last night with Atlanta playing Boston, and they played really, really well, and they snuck out a really good win in Boston without Trae Young. So I think that's kind of how these teams have to move on and survive. Again, when you talk about the Clippers are playing great. They're playing really good basketball without Kawhi. They lose Paul George to Philly. Kawhi's hurt again, and they have all these guys stepping up. Zubats is really showing, I think he's more on the map now than ever before. It seemed like everyone before is just saying, yeah, use him in salary for a trade. And over again, those knowledgeable to the situation said he's kind of the best situation they've got. He's the healthy player who can perform, and he's showing it over and over again why he's so valuable to that team. So I think guys like that just have to continue to step up, and you're just going to see those guys who can perform and continue to win games while these key players are out. Now, obviously, you have the Milwaukee Bucks who just can't, someone like Middleton goes down. He's not even, their second best player, and he's not supposed to be. And he goes down, and they just haven't been able to find their way. Same with Philly. They just can't get in a rhythm. And I think a lot of it is just the inability to find any kind of chemistry when guys are in and out of the rotation can be really difficult as well. So it's not just losing one guy, but it's losing one guy, him coming back, losing another guy, and it's impossible to find any type of chemistry. And I think you're seeing that with a team like Philly.
Having guys shuffling in and out, it really makes things difficult for their teammates and the coaching staff to try to find some kind of consistency. Something that works in terms of lineups is a challenge. Some teams crumble under the pressure, like Philly. And I mean, look at Philly's record. I mean, being 3-8 and then having, or rather 2-8, and then having Paul George and Embiid miss tonight's game is really rough for them against the Cavaliers. So that might be another loss there. So that's definitely one side of the equation. Some teams can't handle it. Other teams do a little bit better. They fare a little bit better and find a missing gem or find a hidden gem in the mix. When it comes to the New Orleans Pelicans, I mean, I think they've hit the hardest so far with injuries. It's absolutely insane. I mean, it was just one after another. You got DeJounte Murray, and then comes Zion Williamson. Trey Murphy just made his return, I believe, or is right on the verge of it after missing some time. You just look at that roster, and it's just one guy after another. Jose Alvarado just went down with an injury. He's going to be out several weeks. So it's almost like when they get a guy back, they lose somebody else. But one bright spot here for New Orleans has definitely been the emergence of Brandon Boston Jr. So he is a player that I think he previously played for the Clippers, and he had flashes. But as we see so many times, it's all about the situation when it comes to young players. Some guys just straight up just don't have what it takes. But other players, they come in and they have flashes, but they don't really have an opportunity to really showcase their game and have the proper amount of minutes to do that. When Brandon has gotten the minutes in the past 5 games, he's played 30 plus minutes in every game. He's actually played 35 or more minutes in the last 4 games for New Orleans. And I will say, yes, it's been rough. They've lost all they've games, but they've found a player that they can definitely invest some time in and rely on to play a big role in the rotation, even when the players get back that have been hurt. So he had 26 points just a couple of games ago at Orlando. He had 20 points a few games ago against the Trailblazers, where he was 9 of 15. And I mean, this is a player that has previously been a spot minutes guy. And now all of a sudden he's averaging 12 points a game with 3 rebounds, 3 assists, shooting 37% from deep and 46% from the field overall. So that's another side effect of these injuries. And you kind of touched on it before, Colin. Sometimes guys that are kind of bringing up the rear in terms of the rotation, they get a chance to shine. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, we have a new impact player on our hands. So it can definitely be a blessing in disguise when it comes to these injuries. And I kind of wanted to quickly touch on like possibly why we've been seeing all these injuries. There have been a lot of explanations for it, and some I agree with, some I don't. But I think at the end of the day, it's just the way the game is played today. I think that's the biggest reason. You have so much ground to cover. The game is nonstop. There are players that are super athletic. They're doing incredible things that probably weren't being done 20, 30 years ago. And when you couple that with, of course, the amount of games, but just how much ground you're covering on defense and offense with the pace and space of the game today, more possessions definitely plays a part. And, you put all that together, you stir it up. That's a recipe for disaster. And I'm curious to see what you think about this, Colin. But this short preseason, some teams only play 4 games in the preseason. Somewhere between 4 and 6, I believe, is the number. So if we're talking about a star player that maybe plays in 2 or 3 or 0, and then they're ramping up into full-on play, maybe that's another reason why we're seeing these injuries here. So what are your thoughts about that? Do you think there's any legitimacy to a quick ramp up or the stylistic play today? Like, what do you think about all that?
I think that's a good point as far as the stylistic play and just, how many possessions these guys are going back and forth and, running cross court, handling the ball. And it's not just this slow dump it in the post, see what happens, plotting kind of offenses that we used to have. And that might be it. But when you're talking about the last 5 years, and if it's an increase, and look, I don't know the statistics. Obviously, we're talking about a lot of star players this year, and that's why it's so notable. I don't know what the statistics are as far as injuries this far into the season in general in comparison to the last 5 years. If it's a spike in the last 5 years, can we relate that in relation to pace? Has it increased that much in the last 5 years where it should be affecting players and injuring them to a greater extent? And as far as the offseason and in the preseason, these guys play. That's the hardest thing to discern because these guys have their own offseason routines. They play their own pickup games. They all train entirely differently. I don't take what I see, obviously in summer league, and then in the preseason as, oh, well, that's the only games that they played. I don't know what they're doing to ramp up in their practices, in their training camps. But maybe, whatever is the consensus that they're doing that they believe is the way to take care of their bodies for the long period of time is what is causing it when they initially start the regular season and they do have that higher intensity. But yeah, it's just hard to say as far as from a basketball standpoint, what their offseason regimen is, what would cause it to, what would link that to early regular season injuries, where it would be different than 5 years ago. You know what I mean? That's
Right.
where it'd be like what is correlating to those early regular season injuries that's different than the past few years.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why it's happening. That's definitely a challenge. We could look at trends for sure. And I think I've seen a couple of posts by people on Twitter, Instagram that have noted that there are a good amount of injuries. Obviously it's early, so we can't say for sure if it's going to continue or not. But it definitely looks to be an increase year over year. So if we're looking at the first 10, 12 games last year compared to this year, I think there is an increase. I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but that is definitely a trend that's concerning. But the positive part, I think, in the way that the NBA has handled it, not specifically for injuries, but just the league in general, is the addition of two-way spots, really just the addition of roster spots in general, just so that teams are more equipped to deal with these types of injuries. I mean, when you have all those players we talked about, plus Paolo, plus KD, plus DeJounte Murray, Chet, who just went down 8 to 10 weeks. That's just a terrible outcome for them. Scotty Barnes, Aaron Gordon, the list goes on and on. It does help that teams have 3 two-way spots. So when you look at the total amount of roster spots, I mean, 18 spots for these teams that they have, it helps so you can provide some depth there because at some point you're going to run into this, whether it's early, whether it's late, you're going to have injuries. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And on that note, Colin, we definitely also wanted to touch on the fact that not all teams are using all 18 spots. There are quite a few teams that have actually only used about 17 spots. So they left one open, and there's actually one team on this list that has a two-way spot open still. So that's definitely interesting. It's something that we both noted. We have a list of all the teams that are currently only using 17 out of 18 spots right now. Those teams are the Celtics, Cavaliers, Pistons, Warriors, Rockets, Heat, Knicks. They're very interesting for a few reasons. The Magic, the Sixers, the Suns, and the Kings. So something that I noticed, and I think this is a big reason as to why they're not using that other spot, and I'm sure you're going to touch on this, Colin, but the fact that a lot of these teams they have a very high payroll. So when you look at the Knicks, the Celtics, the Warriors, the Cavaliers, the Suns, I mean, those are teams with astronomically high payrolls. They're deep into the luxury tax. They're up against aprons. So any little way that teams can kind of trim the fat on that salary, they're going to take advantage of that. So those are the 11 teams. That's over a third of the league that are not using all their spots. So we wanted to highlight that. Colin, I'll let you touch on this a little bit more. Basically explain to everybody why exactly these teams are leaving that spot open and like what are the benefits of having a roster spot open.
Yeah, and just to give a quick breakdown of the rules as far as roster requirements, once the regular season hits, the maximum standard contracts you can have is 15, and the minimum you can have is 14, but you can have 12 or 13 for no longer than 14 consecutive days or 28 days total. So essentially you can have 14 standard contracts throughout the season if you'd like. And that's what these teams seem to be doing. Now, the main reason why they're doing this is because, of course, when you add another standard contract to your roster, it increases your team salary. For a lot of these teams, or a few of these teams that are in the tax, you're just calculating how much you're paying more in the tax bill for a guy who's probably not really going to play. You think of the Celtics who are in whatever bracket now, the third or fourth bracket, as far as the tax bill is concerned. Even if they're signing a minimum vet, that $2 million minimum salary is going to cost them $12 million, just a flat out tax bill. So why would they do that when they can have 14? It's allowed under the rule. And then you can play your two-way guys as well. And you want to get them some run here and there too, right? So there are some limitations from that standpoint as far as activating your two-way guys. You can only have a certain amount of games when you have 14 standard contracts and activated two-way players. So there are some limitations to that, but you can work the system as long as you're not activating all those guys all the time. You're going to be able to work it where you'll be fine. So that's mainly where you're coming from. There's all these teams are in different scenarios where want to have that extra roster spot, whether it's because they're close to an apron threshold, whether they are in the tax, whether they want to maximize being, make sure they're under the tax, different things like that. Again, when they think that spot 14, that guy's just not going to get much play. And on top of that, if I'm a GM in their shoes, the other thing to think about too is it also leaves an open roster spot for flexibility when other players get waived, when the buyout market opens up, and it leaves an open roster spot. If you have to absorb an extra player, you don't have to waive a player before doing so. So it gives you some flexibility on top of not paying an extra guy. We'll see if the rule changes down the line out of frustration of some of these veterans not getting signed, and see if more minimums will have to, or more minimum roster spots have to be filled. But for now, this is the rule. Just one more note that's interesting. The Knicks have 14 roster spots. They were so tight to the second apron after their trades, which they're hard capped at the second apron. They literally cannot go over it, that they had to wait until November 5th and I have this in my CBA notes, it's my most recent one. If you check it out, you'll see the math, but they had to convert their draft pick to a standard contract, and then they signed Matt Ryan. And in doing so, they are just like $400,000 under the second apron. They literally cannot fill that spot. They'll be with the day-to-day salary. If they filled that spot now throughout the season, they would be over the second apron. So they couldn't do it. They have to wait until sometime in February to fill that spot.
That is the one instance here of leaving that spot open that's probably the most interesting, at least to me. Seeing that there's a team that literally cannot fill that spot is pretty wild. And, I can't remember seeing a situation like that recently, but that's kind of the wall that the Knicks kind of put themselves into after all those shenanigans, all those crazy trades that they pulled off, getting Bridges, getting Towns. I mean, that the gymnastics that they've pulled over the past 3 months or so is wild to me. So that's the limitation they're working with. But I mean, like you said, they can sign somebody later on. They just don't have the funds to do it for an extended period of time. So later on the season, they can do it. That's not a huge deal. And I heard that they were thinking about bringing back, I think, Landry Shamet, who was on the roster and got hurt, and they're allowing him to recover. So maybe they bring him back after that time has elapsed, because he was playing well for them when he was on the roster. So that's something to look out for. But the two-way spots are very key, like you mentioned, Colin, and it gives teams a lot more flexibility because they do have those 50 games in which they can be active on an NBA roster. So they can't play every game. Like you said, there's limits. They can only be in certain games. But, I mean, 50 games, that's approaching 2/3 of the NBA season. That's a pretty good amount of games to be able to use these two-way spots. So that definitely helps in the case of injuries or whatever the case is. You just want to get in minutes. You want to develop these guys. That's very important. We've seen several two-way players get called up and have big roles in teams. Like,
well, you brought up Brandon Boston. He's on a two-way.
Yeah, exactly. Brandon Boston, Scottie Pippen Jr. There are several guys that either they make their name under two-way contracts, and then they get converted, and they ride that into a prolific role in the NBA. So those are all great points for sure. And we'll have to see if these teams fill those empty spots. I would say for a team like Detroit, I would say it's a lot more likely that they fill that spot than like a Boston, because like you said, I mean, their payroll is insane, and the multipliers that they're facing are pretty stiff. And in the new CBA, they've just gotten worse, and they penalize teams that are that much over just so much more. So we're talking, several dollars for every $1 they spend on a player. So that's significant for sure. But I think all this it all ties together really well. And it just kind of gives us a good idea of where the NBA is right now and how things might change. And I'm glad you brought up the point about the NBA possibly looking at changing how spots are filled or not filled. We've seen a few things happen this summer and this fall that certain parties might not be happy with. So that could bring about changes in the next CBA. Things are always getting tweaked, so you never know if a rule is going to be changed, if a loophole is going to be closed. I think a lot of things that the Knicks are doing are going to be evaluated in the coming years because they've found a way to get out of some pretty nasty situations and really upgrade their roster. So that's all super important, super interesting there. So I think those are the big topics we wanted to hit on. Colin, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on here?
Yeah, I do want to make mention of one thing. There is a provision in the CBA that does have kind of a fix to that, the minimum standard contracts that I should have mentioned. And essentially it has to do, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of it, but if in the aggregate, the teams do have, I think it's like average of 14.25 standard contracts on each team's roster over 2 seasons, then the minimum does get bumped up to 15. I'm not sure for how long or how that all plays out. I don't know if it's for the rest of the CBA. That is definitely something that the players union put in there. Now, I don't know exactly, when you're sitting at 1/3 of the teams have 14, what are we looking at for an average? We're not getting quite there, but it's close. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how that number plays out as teams like to sit on the 14, those 14 spots.
I'm glad you brought that up. I had actually no idea that was a provision in the CBA.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, these guys really think of everything. That's pretty incredible that they included that. So yeah, I mean, that's something that could change. I mean, like you said, we're really close. So if 11 teams are doing it, maybe the 12th pushes that number right up to that threshold.
Yeah.
So that's something to definitely keep an eye on. So I know for me, for you, Colin, for pretty much everybody that's watching this podcast here, listening to it, we all just want to see better health. We want to see guys return. There's some other players I didn't even mention that are kind of day-to-day with stuff. So we're going to have to keep an eye on those teams, like Jimmy Butler's day-to-day with an ankle injury, for instance. So, yeah, there's a lot of teams and players struggling here with injuries. But luckily enough for these teams, there are ways to combat that. There are ways to get around it, to at least tread water. I mean, obviously teams are going to be worse without these players, but there are ways to still win games and to still stick around and give yourself a chance, because it's not how you start the season, it's how you finish. And if these teams can find a way to weather the storm, they're going to be in great position later on to find a way up the standings and get in pole position here for the playoffs. I think that's about all Colin and I have for this installment of the pod, but we want to thank you guys for tuning in. This was definitely another one of our In the Weeds podcasts. We like to do these a few times a season to get into more of the nitty gritty of the CBA and nerd out a little bit. So we'll have more of these throughout the season as things kind of play out. Once we get into the new year and you start seeing 10-day contracts pop up, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit and talk about some of these other things that happen. Once guys become trade eligible, December and January, that's something else we'll probably look at here. So if you guys are interested in any of this type of stuff, any of these kind of topics, definitely stick around. We're going to have more for you. But in the meantime, we're going to sign out. Colin, thanks again for jumping on. Always a pleasure having you. And, hopefully we get some better luck here with these injuries. And I'm really hoping to see Porzingis back here soon, because he's supposed to be back in the next few weeks, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think what's going to make this season even more interesting, and, usually you hit the doldrums of the regular season towards the end, but so many of these teams, we're not going to know what the team is really like until we get these players back. New Orleans, we're not going to know for a long time. Philly, who knows if they're going to get back to a point of playoff contention. Same with Milwaukee. But so many of these teams, the Clippers, we know them now as a scrappy team. When Kawhi gets back, are they going to be a team that can do some type of damage in the playoffs? And so it's going to be interesting as these players come back, we're going to have a lot more. It's going to be like almost a new regular season when we get into 2024, seeing these players get back. So it'll keep things interesting heading into the All-Star break and leading into the playoffs. Who's for real, who's not, can a team that had players injured and their record isn't that great, are they a lot better now with their team fully healthy? So it's going to be, it'll be interesting.
Oh yeah. You guys definitely don't want to go anywhere. Things can be rough right now, but once these teams get it together, it's going to be a whole different story. So can't wait to see that. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. If you want to go check out the cap notes that Colin has posted on our website, along with all the other content we have for you, it's going to be notradeclause.com. No Trade Clause, one word, on Instagram, _clause on Twitter. We have a lot of key coverage coming for the NBA and also Overtime Elite. If you guys are interested in the OTE, we have content coming on that as well as we attend games, combines, things of that nature. We have a lot coming for you over there as well. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us for another episode. We'll be back next week with more content about the NBA season. But until then, take care, everybody, and we hope to see you soon.